Peter DeSimone, Sustainable Investments Institute co-founder and executive director. Both John and Peter have extensive experience working on investor responsibility issues. And although John's listed first, he's going to be batting cleanup for us today. He'll talk to us about the IRC viewpoints after Peter runs through the report findings. Peter is the co-founder and the lead report author on this study and did all the work on this, so he'll be able to provide quite a bit of insight on it. Just a few words about the IRC Institute. For those of you who aren't familiar with the organization, it's a non-profit organization established in 2005 located in New York City. Essentially what the organization does is it funds and disseminates research at the intersection of corporate responsibility and the informational needs of investors. It doesn't take any advocacy issues, and it's basically just puts out the facts in research on a wide variety of issues. The research examines the capital market context that impacts how investors, companies make decisions. And all the research is available on the IRC Institute website, which is listed here, free of charge. You can download the studies as well as the PowerPoint presentations and press releases for all of the reports. I'll just note that the reports are broad in terms of the topics that they cover, everything from executive compensation, which is always in the headlines, to labor and human rights issues, which are in the headlines recently. Political spending and proxy voting are some of the topics covered on the report. So we invite you to visit the site and take a look at the whole body of research. This report is available on the website as well as the press release. On Monday, we will have this PowerPoint posted as well as an audio replay of this PowerPoint presentation today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Peter DeSimone, the report author and co-founder of the Sustainable Investments Institute. Peter?
Good day, everyone. I just want to say a quick thank you to John and Kelly and to the IRC Institute, which provide the funding for this study. I also need to thank my coworkers, Heidi and Robin, who helped me with the research for this report. And Heidi, SI2's executive director, deserves special thanks for editing it. And it's quite a long report, so thank you again, Heidi, for sifting through all of it and correcting what I'm sure were many of my typos and mistakes. For those of you very quickly unfamiliar with the Sustainable Investments Institute, or SI2 as we call it, we provide impartial research on environmental and social policy resolutions coming to votes at U.S. companies, institutional investors, as well as college and university endowments, foundations, and sustainable and responsible investment funds. We also conduct empirical research on emerging investor and corporate responsibility issues, including this study, which I'm really excited to share some of the additional details about with you today. My contact information will appear on the last slide, so if anybody has any questions, you'll be able to reach out to me then. And so let's get started. Kelly, can we? Thank you. Okay, so I want to give you a brief overview of regulation in the United States as it pertains to integrated reporting. I'm not going to go into tremendous detail here, but I think the information is useful in understanding our approach to our research as well as the findings. Beginning in the 1970s, and due in part to efforts spearheaded by the National Resources Defense Council, or NRDC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, began further defining what companies needed to disclose in annual Form 10-K filings in the way of environmental liabilities, contingencies, and fines. The SEC and other bodies, including the Financial Accounting Standards Board, FASB, the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, and others, have offered further rules and guidance, especially on calculating estimates for liabilities and contingencies over the years. So where we are today can be boiled down to two basic requirements in this area. Any government fines over $100,000 and material liabilities and contingencies, as well as a discussion of any material risks regarding regulatory developments, must be disclosed. And we'll get back to this concept of materiality shortly because it's important. On climate change, the SEC issued interpretive guidance in 2010 following a multi-year campaign, including several petitions from the NRDC, the Serious Coalition, and several other organizations. The guidance essentially said that companies should know what climate change risks were relevant, disclosures to investors, and that they therefore should be disclosing any material information regarding regulatory, commercial, or physical risks to investors. You'll see I'm moving now, sort of transitioning from environmental to social. Um, Dodd-Frank financial reform legislation enacted later in 2010 ushered in several new requirements on conflict minerals, mine safety, and payments to governments, which largely pertain to resource extraction firms. Although I should note the conflict minerals rule applies to all companies potentially sourcing so-called conflict minerals from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. All these rules have now been issued by the SEC, and we have begun, or we will shortly begin, see disclosures for companies on them. The timing, though, is important to point out here, because as we were researching in advance of the SEC finalizing two of these rules, and the one that was enforced, of course, was the one on mine safety, companies were just beginning to address many of them during the study period. So I should add that the rule on conflict minerals also is being challenged in the courts by the National Association of Manufacturers and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on cost grounds, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Dodd-Frank also has a pay disparity disclosure requirement for which the SEC has not issued a draft rule. And even though it's a bit past deadline, there are a number of delays with implementing Dodd-Frank legislation, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. On board diversity, the SEC began requiring disclosures with regard to whether diversity was a factor in deciding on director nominees, and that was back in 2009. In addition, the compensation discussion and analysis, or what's referred to as the CD&A section of the proxy, was revamped by the SEC in 2006, and this is where we looked for links between executive pay and sustainability criteria. Proxy materials also contain information, of course, on board committees and structure, which were not reviewed for this study, although board oversight and sustainability issues is a topic considered to be very important by a number of advocates in this area. Underlying all of these disclosures is the question of materiality. And in a legal sense, it's defined as any information a reasonable investor will want to know about in making an investment decision. And this broad definition of materiality is one where advocates of integrated reporting and others more generally in favor of sustainability disclosures by companies see an opportunity. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about this next. Kelly, can we flip ahead? Thank you. As I said earlier, the NRDC, beginning in the 1970s and throughout the 1980s, was pushing for the SEC to implement better disclosure practices for companies on environmental liabilities, with some success on their part. The NRDC in series began advocating for climate change disclosure in 2006. And again, as I reviewed earlier, they largely won it in 2010. Meanwhile, U.S. SIF wrote a letter to the SEC on mandatory sustainability disclosure, largely aligned with the Global Reporting Initiative, or GRI reporting, back in 2009. And they had several meetings with the SEC staff on the topic and some of the commissioners. More recently, the Corporate Reform Coalition has been drumming up support for an SEC petition on political spending disclosure, which has received an unprecedented number of comments. In fact, they were, I believe, in excess of 500,000 to date. In response, the SEC said in December that it would place the question of political spending disclosure on its regulatory agenda, despite being still tied up with Dodd-Frank implementation. In February last year, CalPERS and 14 other public pension funds, as well as other institutional investors, wrote a letter to the SEC asking it to refine guidance on board diversity and risks related to climate change. But they also pressed the commission to look at how other relevant environmental, social, and governance information can be, and I'm going to quote here for the letter, integrated into financial reporting frameworks, which is an interesting development. Against this backdrop, the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, the most widely used sustainability standard by companies, is issuing its fourth generation of guidelines later this month at its conference in Amsterdam, so I encourage you all to look out for that. At the same time, the Carbon Disclosure Project, or CDP, now sends its questionnaire on climate change to 5,000 companies worldwide with a very impressive response rate. And it has expanded into water, forestry, and supply chain disclosures as well. Firmly more focused on the integration issue, the International Integrated Reporting Committee, or the IIRC, and you'll all have to bear with me because I'm not referring to IRRC, which sponsors the report. But they issued their consultation draft on their international framework, which is open for comment, and I encourage you all to take a look at it and possibly submit comments. Those comments are due on July 15th, and the IRC plans to issue its so-called version 1.0 of its framework in December. Now, there's plenty to talk about regarding developments with the IIRC, and I really can't do it justice in the brief amount of time that we have. But in general, it is based on the expansion of the concept of capital. And in fact, they call a number of the categories where they're reporting capitals in the plural. And beyond the more traditional concepts of financial and manufactured capital, they encompass also intellectual, human, social and relationship, and natural capital as well. And the organization views capital as, I'm going to quote for them, stores of value that in one form or another become inputs to an organization's business model. The group aims to have a global framework, and I should note they view integrated reporting as separate from sustainability reporting. And they view it also largely targeted at investors, although I think many can see the benefits of such reporting for other stakeholders as well. It hasn't defined, however, how it views this type of reporting shaping up in the United States regulatory context. Meanwhile, here in the United States, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, is working on developing reporting standards for U.S. companies based on materiality and with a sector-based approach. It plans to wrap up its standards in the beginning of 2015, and it believes its metrics will be applicable under the present materiality standards I referred to earlier in the United States, and in particular to the annual Form 10K filing, which should be an interesting development to watch. I know that SASB is always looking for industry experts as it rolls out its sector standards, so I encourage you all to go to their website and see if you can get involved. Finally, very quickly, this is a very recent development. Ceres and its investor network on climate risk is working to develop listing requirements for companies on major exchanges. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to sort of align the various sustainability reporting requirements across the exchanges, and they too have a consultation draft available for comment, which I encourage all of you to review. Kelly, next slide. Okay, well, this brings us all to why you're on the phone today, to our study and our research. As probably a lot of you know, we looked at the S&P 500 as it existed in June last year. So, of course, the mix-up of companies would be different today. For each company, we reviewed the Form 10K and the annual report, or the so-called glossy annual report. And we call it that because it used to be the one report that was actually printed. But I have to also point out that it's declining in importance. And I say this because it produced it all, and I should emphasize it only slightly more than 30% of the S&P 500 bothered to issue a completely separate annual report last year, with most only publishing a 10K or putting an introduction from the board and the CEO, some form of a letter or framework to investors at the beginning, and then slapping the 10K onto the back of it. And the reason why I mention this is that much of the information we collected under the annual report banner that you're going to see on the next slides is identical to the Form 10K, although at times some of the information was a bit rosier. We also reviewed sustainability reporting platforms. On sustainability reporting, we first and foremost looked for a report with boundaries, meaning that the report covered a particular time period. However, if none was available, we searched out for more of a fluid reporting format on the web. And then we of course took that information into account for the study. Now, across all three of these documents and on each issue, you can see the issues lined up in that last column, we asked three fundamental questions. We first asked if the company discussed the issue as a financial risk. Second, we wanted to see if the company saw any business opportunities related to the issue, and these could have been from product developments, customer requirements, or cost savings, for example. And finally, we wanted to see if each company attached a monetary value to any of these risks or opportunities. So those were the sort of three major data points that we looked at for each of the issues. And we could go to some of the headlines shortly, but just very briefly, I want to say the issues as they appear on the slides, they're pretty self-explanatory. I will just briefly say that environmental management, for those of you who are wondering, was defined by us as systems to address environmental issues within facilities, and particularly management systems such as ISO 18000. Waste management, as opposed to hazardous waste, if you look on the list, looked at recycling initiatives and other programs to eliminate waste streams outside of the management of hazardous waste. Product formulations, meanwhile, reviewed the way companies were addressing product design, including packaging and conducting life cycle assessments for products. So mind you, there was quite a bit of overlap with issues in double crediting. So for example, if a company redesigned packaging to make it recyclable or to include recycled content or to otherwise eliminate waste, they received credit under waste management and under product formulations. We did not give credit for philanthropic programs or analyze them, and I'm sure this is an omission that a number of people will take issue with. I'll also mention quickly that we analyzed proxy statements for links between executive pay and sustainability performance, as well as for board diversity statements addressing race and or gender. So all told, the study encompassed 113 individual data points per company, and so we have more than 56,000 entries in our system across all of the 500 companies we studied. Sorry about that, Kelly. You can go ahead now and advance. So we ended up finding a lot of reporting out there, although the usefulness of this reporting is up for a bit of debate. All the companies except one had some form of sustainability information meeting our criteria across the documents we reviewed. The one that did not was Zions Corporation, and that's a bank based out of Salt Lake City. Folks had asked me if we contacted them, and we did. We sent 2 notes to them during the study period, but we received no response from them. 74% of the companies placed a dollar value on a sustainability initiative, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but most of the information was anecdotal and attributable to a single project. So maybe it was a retrofit on a building or an office building that saved some electricity or some energy costs, and the company put a dollar figure to it. And I say that as opposed to a dollar figure on some sort of a company-wide strategy or a target or some sort of figure on a return on investment, for example, on a sustainability initiative. 7 companies in our study had integrated reports, but I want to warn that I'm not saying in the report that any 7 of those rose to the definitions for integrated reporting put out there by the proponents. We simply included the few companies that declared their annual report to shareholders as a fully integrated financial and sustainability report. As you can see in the right-hand column there, all of them used the Global Reporting Initiative at the same time and putting those reports together, which I think is an interesting development. Next slide, Kelly, thanks. For the next series of slides, I'm going to be reviewing the issues we studied in order of importance, as measured by the percentage of companies reporting by our qualifying criteria under each. And first off, you'll see here is environmental management, which is probably no surprise to many. In this category, we had a lot of disclosures of capital expenditures on environmental controls, and a lot of discussion about reducing overall operational risks, and especially those related to employee health and safety and associated losses tied to productivity, settlements, and lawsuits as well. Mitigating environmental spills and cleanup and remediation costs, as well as potential fines and lawsuits, also were a concern here for companies. I also should mention that although environmental management topped the list on disclosure overall, it came in second in the number of companies attaching a dollar value to those programs. Hazardous waste beat it out. I think, again, it's just important to keep in mind U.S. regulations in this context because many of the companies discussed environmental management in connection with compliance programs under scrutiny for regulatory risks, liabilities, and contingencies, and government fines. They were already required to disclose in 10Ks to begin with. Another theme I'm going to start to draw out here, you're going to see it on all the slides as we go through these issues, is companies' preference for discussing business opportunities associated with sustainability topics in sustainability reports rather than Form 10Ks or annual reports. And so what we did see more of is a lot more discussion of risks in those other documents. Finally, if you look at the lower right-hand corner of the screen, you'll see some of the top industries for this issue, and utilities, materials, and transportation companies were the most likely to disclose under environmental management. However, as you will see, they also were the most prolific reporters overall in the study, with energy firms close behind. So you're going to see these industries pop up quite a bit under a number of different banners, a number of different issue banners. Thanks, Kelly. We could go ahead to the next slide. Most companies noted the importance of attracting and retaining talent and may describe programs to engage employees about business topics and workplace issues and job satisfaction. A lot of companies talked about benefits to attract and retain employees, and they would be the usual sort of sundry benefits such as health plans or retirement accounts. Diversity also was mentioned quite a bit as a key driver of business success, which was an interesting finding of the report. As you can imagine, health and safety risks also were common, as were risks related to poor employee relations, strikes and other work stoppages. And some of these, again, were required by law. So I'm trying to draw you back into remembering the regulatory context in which all of this disclosure is unfolding. On monetary value, I should note that I broke out the mine safety and other Dodd-Frank disclosures I mentioned earlier. So I didn't allow any double counting there, although I did in the calculations of the overall frequency in which these topics came up. So if you add in the mine safety disclosures, which are entirely, of course, concerned with worker safety, the employment's percentage on the monetary value pie, that's the one at the bottom there on the left-hand side, would have gone up to 4.2%. But still, that would be third overall in our study, and less than half of the 11% counted for hazardous waste, which, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was the top topic to have monetary values attached to it. The themes on risks and opportunities that I mentioned earlier across Form 10Ks, annual reports, and sustainability reports are holding here. If you look at the box dedicated to the topic of by document. The industries most inclined to report unemployment were transportation, utilities, and materials. They're all somewhat labor intensive. They're more heavily unionized in general, and more at risk for workplace injuries. So for them to be among the top reporters, I don't think it's a huge surprise for this study. And let's advance, Kelly, go to the next slide. Given the SEC's guidance and the importance of the issue to stakeholders, I don't think it's a shock to anybody that climate change ended up in the top 3 in our study. Climate change, of course, frequently was discussed in the context of potential regulation in the United States. Many companies also identified the energy efficiency of their operations and products as sound investments, and they produce returns, competitive oftentimes, companies would mention, with other competing demands for capital, which I think is an interesting development. These disclosures spoke somewhat to the SEC's commercial risk guidance, but there are also plenty of those foreboding statements on physical risks in 10Ks that we drew out from our study, and those would be risks related to things like severe storms or changing weather patterns. And they also tend to be some of the more tricky risks for companies to get a handle on because of the time period that we're discussing here. It's such a long-range window. Energy-intensive industries were the top reporters here. I think the only surprise maybe was that the energy sector itself didn't end up in the top 3. But I think seeing utilities, transportation, and materials firms here, again, is no surprise to anyone. Let's go ahead, Kelly. Thank you. Most companies describe risks related to hazardous waste in their annual Form 10K filings, and this was the only sustainability topic discussed by a majority of companies in any one specific reporting format. Many of these disclosures were related to pending litigation, as you would expect. There was some, talk again of risk mitigation efforts that factored into these disclosures, and again, a lot of them were surrounding the reporting out of government funds as well, and of course, a lot of this would be reporting on potential Superfund sites. The industry sectors featured, again, I don't think should be shocking to anyone. And we finally saw energy pop up here into the number 3 spot. Let's go ahead, Kelly. As I mentioned earlier, the disclosures on product formulations related to product life cycle assessments, as well as the marketing of green or fair trade or other types of sustainable products. Most disclosures happen in sustainability reports, as you're going to see here. The industry sectors might be a bit surprising to some because they're not as consumer focused as a number of other sectors, but the industries here with the most disclosures do have consumer-facing products and services. Transportation, for example, includes airlines. The transportation companies focus a lot on providing solutions for their business clients that cut costs and carbon footprints. A lot of these, of course, for the rail firms we profiled. Utilities talked about products